Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The new JSSJ graduate level certificate program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, equips professionals with invaluable skills, tools, and resources that organizations need to bridge generational gaps and ensure inclusive growth. Learn from renowned experts like Julia Watts-Belzer in her upcoming course, Disability and Jewish Social Justice. Apply for her class by May 15th. Go to usfca.edu/JEDI. That's usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 430. Zines are Torah. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're talking about the subject of Jewish zines with our guest today, Chava Shapiro, who is the founder of the Jewish Zine Archive, an archival collection of Jewish zines and a digital Jewish cultural space. Now, a lot of our listeners are going to say, I love Jewish zines. I can't wait to learn more about them. Let's get started. Others of you will say, what is a Jewish zine? Actually, what is a zine? We think that both kind of listeners and everyone in between are going to love this conversation, and we think you're going to want to learn more about Jewish zines in Chava's upcoming 3-session Yeshiva class called Unraveling Jewish Zines, from Rashi to the Haggadah to Instagram. But we're going to get deep into an understanding of what zines are in just a few minutes. So if you do end up feeling like you love this conversation and you want to register for Chava's class, head over to judaismunbound.com/classes, where you can sign up. And while you're there, you can check out the other classes that are on offer. Our newest bunch of Yeshiva 3-week mini courses this semester. In addition to Chava's class, we're offering 2 other classes. One is called Birthing and Dying, Reimagining Life's Many Beginnings and Endings Jewishly, taught by Miriam Grossman, and a class called Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, the Torah of Wholeness and Belonging, taught by C.B. Souther. So again, visit judaismunbound.com/classes to learn more about these classes and to register for them. And don't forget that financial aid is available because we don't want cost to be a barrier to learning. Now, for just a few more words of introduction for our guest today, Chava Shapiro is the founder of the Jewish Zine Archive, as well as an artist and an activist. As an artist and writer, they explore histories of resistance, identity, erasure, and collective memory. As an activist, they've participated in nearly 20 years of anarchist and community-based organizing, striving to root in Jewish histories of resistance and engage in acts of solidarity and co-creation. Chava has also been an amazing listener to Judaism Unbound, somebody who has been in Yeshiva classes and has participated in other gatherings that we've done over the years. So it is super exciting to welcome somebody who's been a listener and who's become a friend over so many years. So Chava Shapiro, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to finally have you here on the podcast.
Yeah, no, it's super fun to be on the show. I feel like we've encountered each other in different realms of Yeshiva class and learning together. And now to be on the show is really fun.
That actually kind of leads me into this opening question, because I'm like, oh, I know I've known you for a long time and I know what you're doing and I'm really excited about it. But I'm thinking about my dad, who sometimes listens to the show. But I'm thinking if he were listening to this conversation, his question would be, what is a zine? What even is that? And I think that there's a lot of listeners of ours who know what a zine is, but I think that they can also learn a thing or two. So could you give us a little bit of a sense of, like, when we say a zine, what are we talking about?
Yeah, first, I want to say hi to your dad. What is a zine? I love that you know it's said zine. There are a lot of people who have only ever seen it written down and might feel like impulsively to pronounce it Zine. That's my favorite when that happens, because it means they've been reading them, but they've been reading them kind of in this little alone world and encountering them as text or imagery, but don't know that it's like short for magazine. So zine is how a lot of people say it. I also stand for the people who pronounce it Zine.
We need like an Old Lang Syne, like a zine that's about the song Old Lang Syne.
Amazing. So what is a zine? A kind of agreed upon definition. You might find this on like the Barnard College Zine Library website, but a zine's self-published. It's non-commercial print work. It can be written content. It could be personal narrative. It could just be imagery, but they're produced typically small, limited batches, and they're created and bound in a lot of different ways, often in a booklet style. But I've even seen zines that are made out of Amazon packaging, like the bubble wrap envelopes. And traditionally speaking, if we can say something is traditional about zines, they're made by hand and they're also intended to be easily reproducible, which is my favorite part about it. A democratization of bookmaking, of literature distribution, of art distribution that allows for individual people to put their work out there, either just for the sake of their own selves or to share broadly with a lot of different people.
So I think I have two related questions. One is, can you talk a little bit more about the people who make zines and what they're up to? Like, why are they doing that? Is it self-consciously part of a tradition of zine making, or are they people who, have something to say? Like, I think of, Thomas Paine writing Common Sense, was trying to get out a set of ideas, to promote the American Revolution. And, this was early days of printing. And so I think it was printed on a printing press, but not commercial in the way that we think of it, because it was a guy that had an idea that he wanted to get out there. Is that kind of the impulse, or is there kind of now even more of kind of a zine movement? I think that's one question I have. And then I'm also wondering, what is the history of Jewish zines? And I know in the description of your class, you talk about the Passover Haggadah as a zine, which I love, and I would love to pursue that. And I know that we can go back, thousands of years, and maybe that's the only way to talk about the history of Jewish zine making. But I'm wondering if there's like a more recent history also, where really this started in the 70s and it was because of the feminist movement or whatever it might be, that this is where the modern thing that we think of as a zine really started in terms of what Jews are doing with it.
So there's a provocation I made through the Jewish Zine Archive, which is a project that I started in 2019 while working for the Tucson Jewish History Museum and Holocaust Center. And the provocation was the Haggadah is the original Jewish zine. A couple of years later, when I did the first Jewish Zine Fest that we know of, is the first one that anyone knows of. Maybe there was another one, who knows? But this was the first one we knew of. And at the Jewish Zine Fest, I retracted my prior statement that the Haggadah was the first Jewish zine. And then I said Rashi was the first Jewish zinester. So zinester is a term that gets used about the community, really, or the culture that you're talking about, the subculture of people who make zines, and they call themselves zinesters, and they have fests and swaps and trades, but not unlike Thomas Paine and his desire to create radical revolution. Whether he did that or not is questionable. But Rashi was also doing something, putting out something that was called kuntros, pamphlets. And this is pre-printing press. When Rashi was doing it, he's handwriting these. And he's just like out there like, hey, read my zine.
This is 11th century. If we just to put it time-wise, it's about 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's hundreds of years before the printing press, right? And the printing press, even when that gets, invented by Gutenberg, it's very expensive to have like a printed book. They're a very special, expensive object. But Rashi's out there like, read my pamphlet. I have something to say about Torah. I have something to say about the entire Talmud. And I think people make zines for the same reason that Rashi made a zine, that Thomas Paine made a zine, and that Star Trek fans in the 60s and 70s started making something that's now known as slash fic, which was the origins of fan fiction. It's actually queer pamphlets that people made and were swapping around about love stories and intimate tales, if you will, between Captain Kirk and Spock. Also, Captain Kirk, Spock, and Chekhov on that show, all played by Jews, right? So I argue also that those are Jewish zines, right? Even if the people who made that slash fic weren't Jews themselves, the content is Jewish. And so for me, while I myself started making zines when I was 13 years old, The first zine I made was called Stolen Goods. I didn't even know that you could fold the paper in half. I just stapled it, 8.5 by 11 paper, stapled it together. And it was like about punk music and shows I was going to in the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, which is a hard place to be a punk in the 90s. And it was a hard place to be a Jew in the 90s for sure. But I wanted to make a zine for reasons that were actually really similar to why Rashi wanted to make a zine. It's an impulse to communicate about yourself and to be in conversation with the world around you. So there's a really broad global community of zinesters out there. My interest is in zines writ large, like personally, but the project of the Jewish Zine Archive is really about creating, well, it started about creating a physical and digital archive, which is just a fancy word for like a collection of stuff, but a physical and digital archive of zines made by writers or artists who identify as Jewish or with Jewishness and or Judaism, or the content relates to Jewishness and or Judaism. And I do like distinguish between Jewishness and Judaism, right? To me, that there is something different about those things, but not every zine that's in the collection of this archive is made by someone that you or I might recognize as legibly Jewish, but they are writing about something that relates to Jewish life, Jewish history, Jewish art, etc.
So let's keep rolling with this what is a zine piece. I don't disagree with anything you said, but I want to hone it because if I had been asked about what's a zine, I would jump not only to like Thomas Paine, Rashi, people who have things to say, but people who have things to depict or display. Because when I think of zines, part of the core feature generally, this, I don't think you become not a zine if you don't have illustrations, but like generally the zines that I'm familiar with, they are really excited to blend together text and image. And often it's in really, to use, our terminology, it's like in unbound ways. Part of the benefit of a zine format that is not a mass-produced book, like when you mass-produce something, doing all sorts of funky, interesting things with the margins of the pages or changing the way one page and then the next page, like having illustrations of one kind on one page and then just text the next. And like you kind of have to pick and choose your radicalnesses. Like you can do a little, but with a zine, there's fewer rules. But maybe there are some rules, but I think it's kind of the whole point of the genre to upend genres. It's like we're going to mix together stuff I draw with a pencil and stuff that's printed on a computer. We're going to mix together like textures and other, like I've seen zines that I think do all of that stuff. And I don't think it's just that, zines are an interesting place where people do that. I think Davka specifically, the upending of book rules, of medium rules, feels like something that zines are doing. So can you talk to us a little more about like the visual elements of this and the ways in which zines are not just ways to sort of say interesting things, but upend the formats in which we say them?
Absolutely. I started with saying that there's sort of like if there's a traditional definition that you might find on a website somewhere, or you might notice that I mentioned like Barnard College, which has an incredible zine library. And if you ever have the chance to visit it in person, I highly recommend that you do. But that's an academic definition at this point in time. And the real definition is it's creating something as yourself to put out into the world and just throw out into the ether. And it might be something that's highly visual. It might be like I took a single piece of paper and I drew pictures talking about the time I had like a really crazy menstrual cycle. Like that too is a zine, right? I've seen zines that are made out of like literal leaves and then sewn together and things drawn and written onto like physical plant matter. That's also a zine. I'm very, very inspired by the period of artistic movements and radical political movements in the early 20th century through the mid 20th century. And when I think about like exactly the question you're asking, I look back and I look at the Dada movement, which was a movement that began amid the First World War and emerged out of really war resistors, people who were dodging drafts, largely Jews, dodging the draft and found themselves in Zurich, which was not fighting during World War I. And one of those Jews who fled Romania, where you couldn't be a citizen if you were a Jew, but you could be drafted. And so a lot of young Jewish men left and went to Zurich. And one of those Jews was Tristan Tzara. Tristan Tzara was a kid, really. I look back, I'm like, you're like 20 years old, you're 19 years old, and you invented this entire artistic movement along with your weird friends while you were kind of bored and draft dodging, which is an amazing origin story. But what they were doing was breaking art. They were, in the breaking of art, democratizing art. And Tristan Tzara created the Dada Journal, which, like many great zines made by weirdos in like a DIY scene, a do-it-yourself zine, or not zine, scene.
Shkoyach, it's both, etc.
Thank you. But he created the Dada Journal, and it's a mix of visual playing and breaking and remolding typography, literally letters, right? And creating new written word, but also visual pieces. And like many of those great impulsive DIY zines out there in the world, Dada Journal had like six of them. And then they're like, oh, I don't have any more energy for that. And so it's short-lived. But I also think that's mixed in with what you're talking about, Lex, is the impulse to take imagery and communicate as well. And there's a lot of different ways that people are doing that. I also think that zines are breaking through this digital era, which I know is like a hot button issue on Judaism Unbound. Like, what is the digital landscape? How does this realm interplay with our physical lived experiences? And I think that's happening with zines too, because now zines are totally unbound. I see people making what they would say are fully digital audio pieces. They're like, it's not a podcast. It's not a audio documentary. It's a zine because it's an ethic. It's not only something that is defined by its physical nature, but it's something that people are committing to as an ethic or a value, a DIY, a do-it-yourself approach to communicating yourself to the world around you.
It's interesting. Like, I was thinking, like, is Judaism Unbound a zine? And I don't want to like say it is. Like, my point is not to like muscle in on this territory and say Judaism Unbound is a zine, but some of the ethic that you're talking about feels very familiar to me. Like, it's different, but it feels like in those early days, 8 years ago, when we started Judaism Unbound, we didn't have any money. So the only way that we could do it in the way that we were trying was a podcast, because it was audio. I mean, we called it a podcast, but part of me feels like we could have called it a zine maybe, or an audio zine, if that concept had been in either of our heads. We've tried to make Judaism Unbound a platform where there could be, regular zines, but there's just something about the ethos that I'm reacting to. There's just something about this like scrappy, this saying, we have something that we're desperate to get out into the world. How do we do it? We don't have the capacity for various reasons. So it's like you take the tools that you have and you make the best of them.
Part of the original inspiration for this project, for the Jewish Zine Archive, was Emanuel Ringelblum's Oneg Shabbos, which was a group of people that Emanuel Ringelblum, a historian who was then forced to live in the Warsaw Ghetto during World War II. He started a group called Oneg Shabbos, which means joy of Shabbat. And they called it that because they met on Saturdays. It was both people who had been historians in their careers, but also people who just really felt a deep need to document not only what was happening in that moment of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, but also their lives before to say, like, we were here. And really notably, one of the people who participated in the Oneg Shabbos, David Graeber, was a 19-year-old kid. And he's quoted, if you'll humor me, he's quoted, he wrote on this day, Monday, August 3rd, 1942, and he signed it even with the time, it was 4 p.m. And he wrote, "One of the streets next to us has been already blocked. The moods are horrible. We expect the worst. We're in a hurry. Goodbye. I hope we will manage to bury it. What we've been unable to shout out to the world, we buried in the ground." They literally took everything they had collected and hid it in milk cans, milk tins, and buried it in the ground. And it was found years later and recovered after the war had happened. And this impulse to make sure that we write our own stories. This is also something that the scholar and incredible writer Sitya Hartman talks about as well in her books and in her essays. And she's writing from the experience of being a Black person and also a scholar of Black history in this country. And she writes about just the deep importance of not only in the moment that we document ourselves, which largely was unable to happen for Black people in this country, right? Because of the deep horrors of white supremacy. But also, she says that for us now, when we look back at the archive, we have to do something that she calls critical fabulation, that like we need to fill out the stories. And she says to tell an impossible story. That's like the duty of the archivist. And I love talking about zines, but I also like talking about the archival aspect of the project. It is really important, and it's a deeply Jewish impulse. It's a deeply human impulse, right? That we tell our own stories, and zines are a way that we can do that. A friend of mine sent me the classic meme image of like, it's from an anime of a person holding their hand up and they're looking toward a butterfly flying at them.
Yep, of course.
And yeah, it's like one of the true classic memes. It'll go down in the history books. But they sent it to me and they're like, Jewish zine archive on the person staring at the butterfly. And the butterfly, it says, "Is this a zine?" But I maybe anachronistically want to project back. And I want to project back and say, like, create this kind of critical fabulation of what is and isn't a zine. Because I think you're right, Dan. It's an ethos that we have this impulse to communicate ourselves to each other, to tell our stories. I think that that's a really beautiful, powerful thing. And in this moment in time, maybe a really, really necessary thing.
So I love this, specifically that meme reference. We'll throw it in the show notes for those who didn't quite grok it. But basically, the notion of this meme, the person who's looking at the butterfly, they're kind of seen as stretching. They're seen as stretching the definition of whatever is labeled the butterfly. But it's also a little bit true. Like, is this a zine? Even for things that might not be obviously seen as zines. So just to explain that for folks who are less familiar with the meme. I want to get to some of the particulars of the zines that you've created and co-created as the Jewish Zine Archive. So I guess I've got two parts. I'm curious if you can like shout out particular zines that will help us get a flavor of your approach to zines. In particular, I know you've done a series of zines related to the months of the year, and maybe that'll help us get some texture. But what I've loved about that is consistently in that ancient tradition of zine making, you've been featuring voices that I think people know are Jewish, but are not always connected to, you know, to use your terminology, Judaism. I'm a big lover of Emma Goldman, for example, who, when she's talked about with respect to her Jewishness, is sort of, I think, dismissed in terms of her relationship to Judaism. She's seen as like, oh, she was very anti-religious, but I disagree with that characterization. And you made a zine for the month of Sivan, which is one of my favorite months. It contains my favorite holiday, Shavuot, that was anchored to Emma Goldman. But I'd love to get a sense of just like what some of your particular contributions as JZA have been to this Jewish ziniverse. And the second part is you convened a massive fest. I mean, you mentioned it, but like at some point you said like, hey, we're going to do a festival of Jewish zines. And I mean, maybe I was not ambitious enough. I was like, oh, there'll be a couple of these things. That's great. Weren't there something like a dozen of these?
The first year, I think we had 14 pop-up events on 3 continents. And the second year, we had similar, maybe 15, 16 events, pop-up events in 3 different parts of the world.
So that's incredible. And the way that that sort of caught fire from one Instagram account, can you talk to us a little bit about the particular zines that you've contributed into the world through JZA, and also like what's been happening with this Jewish Zine Fest?
Yeah, largely my zine making throughout my life has been, I had never thought of it as being Jewish zine making. I thought of it as like, I'm a punk. I really mean that. Like, I have been highly involved in like the punk DIY music scenes throughout my life since I was a teenager. And the thing I often say about my love of zines is that I kind of fell out of love with God at the time I had a bat mitzvah. And I fell really hard in love with punk rock, specifically Riot Grrrl music and hardcore music, the DC punk scene of the 80s and 90s. And that was my introduction to zines. Zines that were largely about DIY music scenes, but also about politics. And the majority of the zine making I've done in my adult life over the course of the last 20 years has been about politics, specifically anarchist, anti-state communist politics. And that's why I've made not only more like one zine about Emma Goldman, I've made a lot of zines about Emma Goldman over the course of the years.
Love it.
But when I had the Zuckerman Fellowship at the Tucson Jewish Museum and I first started this project, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I was like, oh, I'll make a collection. I'll get a box and I'll put zines in it that Jews have made. But it was inspired because I encountered one person's zine. Ezra Rose is this incredible artist and zine maker and self-identified Jewish goth from Western Massachusetts. And they made a zine called 6 Songs, which is gorgeous illustrations of Jewish demons, Shadim. When I encountered that, I was like, oh, hold on a second. The zines I've been making my whole life are Jewish zines. What excited me about looking back at people like Emma Goldman was to look at their Jewishness. There's no way that we can look at Emma Goldman, one of the most like heralded anarchists of history, and not as Jews see so clearly her Jewishness, despite the fact that she was an atheist. And I would say she was not anti-religious so much as she was anti-clerical, which was an important political moment and defining moment against the power of things like the Catholic Church and the Vatican. And for Jews, the power of the rabbinate, which is like the clerical order and political power that Jews were subjected to. And so Emma Goldman, as Jews, we look back at her and we're like, oh, so Jewish, right? When I started this project of the Jewish Zine Archive, I thought, oh, I'll throw zines in a box. I love this. But then it also made me really start thinking about producing new work and writing zines that were much more about my own Jewish explorations. I have to express like a lot of deep gratitude actually to Judaism Unbound, because that coincided with some really pivotal moments in my own life and gave me a space to find other Jews who were thinking about expanding, exploding, and taking off the bounds of the Judaism that I needed to get distance from. And that resulted in also becoming a small publishing project. We have a monthly zine subscription. And similarly, that was the impulse for the Jewish Zine Fest. Jewish Zine Fest started as like, what if I just said we're doing it? And I want to like really take the veil off of that to encourage every person who listens to this show. When you're wondering like, wouldn't it be cool if there was blank thing in the Jewish universe? What if you just did it? What if you just did it? Go out there and give it a try. The Jewish Zine Archive has largely reached people through Instagram. And when we put out the call and the call is loose, we just said, we're doing a Jewish Zine Fest and it's going to be online and you could sign up to host an in-person event. I didn't expect that many people to say they wanted to do it. And I definitely didn't expect for somebody from Jerusalem to say, like, we want to do something in Jerusalem at a cafe and we want to partner with like some of our Palestinian comrades and do something cool here. That blew my mind. I had no idea. I didn't expect that somebody in Australia would want to participate. In the same way that the ethos, the ethic of zines is really DIY, I argue the ethos of Jewishness and Judaism is DIY. We are a do-it-yourself people. And when we think stuff up, we're just like, man, wouldn't it be cool if this happened? And then people do it. And so that's what's happened with Jewish Zine Fest. It happened 2 years in a row, 2022 and 2023. And I was just looking at the calendar to see when Av and Elul fall on the solar calendar this year to set dates, hopefully soon, for the third Jewish Zine Fest.
So I just want to understand, like, briefly, like, some of the, I don't know, like, technical elements of the zine archive. I guess I'm curious about, how do you get the zines? Who sends them to you? You know, what's the archiving part? You know, where are they? What do you imagine in, the future? Like, can somebody go and see all these? Like, what is the archiving part of it? And then also, like, the thing that you were just talking about in terms of you can subscribe to zines. Like, how does that happen? Like, you have relationships with certain zine creators and they send you a bazillion zines and you send them out, or they send you just the file and then you print them out. You know, how does it all happen?
The physical archive is housed in a autonomous community space in Tucson, Arizona. Guests on the lands of Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui people, a very unlikely place for a lot of things. And maybe not the place people imagine as being like a real Jewish hotspot. And that's where the physical archive is housed. Even though at the time that I started it, I worked at a museum and had a lot of access to infrastructure for an archival project, I made a conscious decision to put it in a non-Jewish community space. We share what we kind of lovingly call an archival commune, which is a much nicer way to say a crowded office in this community center, the Blackledge Community Collective. And we share it with the Arizona Queer Archives, archival and media project called Perilous Chronicle, which works with incarcerated people, chronicling instances of self-organizing and uprising within prisons across this continent. A small press project that's called Strangers in a Tangled Wilderness, and a couple of other smaller community-based archival and small publishing projects. And I wanted to put it in a space like that because I think Jews, one, have always been impacted by and impacted the community that they dwelled in. Judaism and Jews have never actually really been this like separate enclave. It's always been cultural exchange. And I want to maintain that. And also in this era of elevated anti-Semitism, I think it's the way that Jews keep ourselves safest is by making sure that we are really in relationship with other people who are in struggle against the things that can cause Jews harm. Those are the same things that cause many, many other people harm. The archival aspect of it, how do we get the zines? We have a Google form. People fill it out. They can attach a digital file or they can mail to a PO box, old school style. My favorite highlight of the month is when I go to my PO box and see what special treats are awaiting me inside of it. So people send zines, physically or digitally. And then as far as the subscription model, we called it community supported zines, or kind of modeled after the community supported agriculture, like CSAs. It's a CSZ, a community supported zine, and people can pay $10 a month or more if they wish to support the project with more and they have more to give, and they get a zine every couple months, and you get other fun, surprising, interesting things in there.
So let's go to your mini course with us. We've gotten a little taste of it. I think elements of what you talked about at the beginning about thinking of Rashi as early kinds of Jewish zine, thinking of Star Trek as differently inflected kinds of Jewish zine. So that's a taste. What is this 3-week experience going to be like for folks? Like, obviously there's a gazillion and a half things we could conceive of as zines, and maybe even that we could conceive of as Jewish zines. But can you take us a little bit into some of the angles of your 3 weeks?
Yeah, I am so excited. I have to try not to swear because when I get excited, I like swear and I curse.
Swear is fine.
I'm so fucking excited for this class. I'm so
Explicit label.
Stoked to get into a Zoom room with people who want to hear about a history of zines, Jewish zines in particular, but we'll talk kind of about the overview of history of zines. But we'll also look at Jewish participation in zine culture and zine making. And then we're going to cover stuff like ranging from Rashi all the way through like anti-fascist teens, teenagers, kids that were making a journal, or what I would say is like definitely a zine during the Shoah, during World War II. And we're also going to talk about zines as like a possible ritual object. I don't know about how everyone is feeling post October 7th. But I can say how I've been feeling post October 7th. It's hard to imagine, and it's hard for me to sit down and make a zine right now. And I think it's hard for a lot of people to make art right now. In the same way that people look back at the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE and say, wow, that was a big crash. And using that language from Rabbi B'nai Lappi, one of my teachers, who I first learned about on Judaism Unbound. Now I learn Talmud and am a fellow with Svara and teach Talmud. But B'nai, she talks about these crashes, and the temple is like the ultimate Jewish crash in our minds today. But I think we will look back at October 7 and we will think of that as many years in the future as like the height of this crash that actually Judaism Unbound has been tracking for the last 8 years. It's hard for us to make a zine amid this crash, but I think it's so important. Theodore Adorno, a cultural critic, if he could be a friend of the pod today, I think he might be, but he was definitely a friend of many Jews, many like important Jews of the mid-20th century, Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin. But Theodore Adorno said kind of infamously, and it's been misquoted many times or misapplied, that there could really not be poetry after Auschwitz. To create would somehow reify what he called the barbarism of Auschwitz. And I worry about that myself in the zine making I'm doing right now, post October 7th. And I think other people are worried about that right now too. But Adorno then a few years later, not quite retracted. He's not the retracting type, but he did reshape and expand what he had to say in response to a Jewish poet, Paul Celan, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, Jewish or not. And Paul Celan wrote intentionally, not in the language of his like mother tongue, but he wrote in German after surviving the Holocaust and surviving the camps. He wrote in German because it felt so necessary for him to tell his own stories of some of the worst horrors humans have seen in the voice, the sounds of the very people who did that to him and others. And I think that that's a really important piece of what we'll talk about in this class, and what I hope we'll do together in this class is we will find a way to also collectively tell our stories. Over the course of these 3 weeks, we'll be engaging in, and people will be invited both in class time and on their own time, but like no homework, no pressure. We'll have a container within class time to create a zine together that'll be available through the Jewish Zine Archive, and I'm sure up through Judaism Unbound as well, that people can access. So there will be also like a lasting document that comes out of this class that I think will also reinforce that core ethos we've been talking about of of telling our stories, of communicating ourselves to the world around us.
I love that. And in our fashion, we're going to jump from like the immediacy of your class to a zoom out to where we started. The grand history, thousands of years of Jewish zines. You started and you talked about how initially you were going with the argument that the Haggadah, the Passover guidebook, whatever we call it, is sort of the original Jewish zine. And you said that you retracted that. And I thought what you were going to say was, I retracted that the Haggadah, which didn't come together until, I mean, the earliest pieces came together in like 200 CE, but really it was a long process beyond that, taking hundreds of more years. Like, I thought what you were going to say is, I retracted that the Haggadah was the original Jewish zine because I actually wanted to argue that the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, was the OG Jewish zine. And you didn't say that, and I'm not saying you are wrong, but I am curious as a further clarifier or honer of what is and is not a Jewish zine, whether you could tackle like the Hebrew Bible for us. Are there characteristics of it that point you to, yeah, this could be zine or zine-ish? And are there others that don't? Like, help us understand this what is a zine question through this core canonical text of Jewish tradition.
Yeah, is the Tanakh, is that the original Jewish zine? Maybe my answer kind of goes back to, for the Jewish Zine Archive, for our, defining characteristics and having to hash out like what is included or what's excluded from this archive. Part of it was trying to figure out these questions of like identification with Jewishness and or Judaism. But people have defined their connection to Jewishness and Jewish identity totally differently throughout time, space, and place. And I think it's been so important and so necessary to create this diversity of identities and cultures that get housed within or beneath this large umbrella that we call Jewishness. And I think that that's a strength. It's not a detriment. And similarly, I would apply that then to this question of like, what's a zine? What are we going to call a Jewish zine? I kind of subscribe to Harold Bloom's positions, though he was not a scholar of Torah necessarily. He is also very, very knowledgeable about literature. And I do really subscribe to his position, historical position, about one of the writers of Tanakh being a woman, the J writer. What I love when I look at the pieces that are attributed to this J writer, and I think about her as a woman, largely on the outside of not a fully patriarchal society at that time, but a largely patriarchal society. And I think about her deep desire to capture her story. And her story was actually the story of a lot of people. And I think what's beautiful about this academic position about the J writer being a woman, and when you look at the pieces of Torah that are hers, right, her voice, these are some of the most like beautiful, expansive, poetic, striking theological points of all of Tanakh. And to me, that is really like the answer to your question. Like, what's the original Jewish zine? I'm going to say it's not just Tanakh, but that it's the J writers' writings that are within Tanakh. That kind of outside position, although was she really an outsider? We don't know. We can't say for sure, but I project that back to her. And as someone who's, queer and non-binary and a Jew and a weirdo and a punk, I see something of myself in her writing. And yeah, Lex, I think you're right. I would just tweak it a little bit. I think it's the J writer. I think it's her contributions to Tanakh. That's the original Jewish zine. Maybe it's because I spend like a lot of hours of my week the last 4 years studying the Talmud. I'm so ready to be convinced by another provocation. So thank you for the provocation, Lex. We now can say, and the meme is coming, like the original Jewish zine is the J writer.
One of the questions about zines and what's a zine is like, who's elite and who's marginal, and does somebody sometimes move from the elite to the margins, and then it's the kind of pain of that leads to this creativity. I think you've been connecting us to the world of art and Dada and all that kind of stuff, and just that impulse, and it's something that we've been interested in on Judaism Unbound from the beginning that I'm still not quite able to articulate, but I actually feel like maybe you'll be able to answer it a little bit, which is the impulse to make art as actually a really important piece of the future of Judaism that we dream of. How to better harness artists, but also not necessarily professional artists like zine makers, that calling to create, that need to, like you say, accept a provocation and to retract and to revise and to have, like, I think that's the aliveness of Judaism that at least I yearn for and often don't find, but have found more and more in this neck of the woods that, I've been living in for the last decade or so.
I think about this a lot. I think about like, what are the possible futures of Judaism, of Jewishness? At Sfara, the yeshiva that I learned with, founded by B'nai Lappi, maybe the original friend of this pod, by the way.
Yes,
for sure. Yeah,
our first guest, absolutely.
The first friend of the pod, but we had a conversation series over the winter called The Unrecognizable Jewish Future, really because that provocation of an unrecognizable Jewish future, that starting with the 90s Jewish population survey, Benet's story of her teacher at Jewish Theological Seminary coming back and saying like, oh, sorry, I'm late to class. I had this crazy conversation with one of the people who did the survey. The person doing this survey was like, we've got good news and bad news. The good news is like, yeah, there's going to be Jews in the future. Bad news is it'll be totally unrecognizable to any of us who are alive right now. To me, that's a miracle. And we're living it right now. I think every time that I open a volume of Talmud or a Jewish zine, wow, my ancestors would never have anticipated this, right? With me opening the volume of Talmud, there are a million reasons why they didn't anticipate I'd be the one to open it. And with the zine, they would have never anticipated that Jews would get so fucking weird, like that we would just be so out there. But I mean, how could we not be? The origins of rabbinic Judaism, some real weirdos. And I think like the history of Jewishness is like, we lean into being a weirdo. And what does that have to do with art? Like, to bring it back to that question, a future of Jewishness for me is like, we're getting weirder. I think we're so cool right now. And I hope that when I'm an ancestor, far in the future, that when I look at our descendants, God willing, like I'll have some view into that realm, that it'll look so weird to me that maybe davening is like, in the future, maybe it's people get together in a room with art supplies, Jewish studio project style, and say, oh, this is how we commune with the divine presence. We just like make art. And maybe that's davening in the future. Because it was pretty weird that like prayer even came to be like how we commune with the divine presence. We went from like sacrificing animals to saying words out loud in a group to then like women and people who weren't allowed to be classified as men took davening and prayer somewhere totally else, to chines, which is the Yiddish word for spontaneous prayer. And that wasn't a thing before women and people who weren't allowed to be called or classified men. That wasn't a thing, spontaneous prayer in Judaism, but then it became one. It's at the core of this podcast, and it's the core of the Jewish Zine Archive, and it's at the core of most of the guests who've ever been on this show or ever taught an Anya Yeshiva course or have attended one, that like what's happening on the margins of Judaism, that will become something at the center in the future. And then we're going to have to break it again. Like, we're going to have to crash again. And we're going to have to, we'll move on from zines as the way we daven to who knows what. But I'm fully excited for all of the possibilities. And I think you're right, Dan, that art is really a core part of the reinvention and reinvigoration of Judaism right now. So I always want to like notice what's happening, but not hold it too tight so that we leave room for other possible futures.
I really want to celebrate and hold the punk side of your influences and the anarchism side of your influences. We've done some of that. I'm ready to do more. We shouted out Emma Goldman, who was, of course, preeminent Jewish anarchist. You said a little while ago to me, thanks for that provocation. And that is something that only somebody influenced by, or that many people influenced by anarchism might say. Thanks for that provocation. Provocation as celebration, as good, because we recognize that we do have this broken world and we must be provoking at it to channel it towards something better. I just have a feeling that a closing note related to why anarchism or even Jewish anarchism matters to this world of zining. I just have a feeling that that's the right directions to go. So can you bring us out just with this sacred endeavor that is Jewish zine making or zine making more generally? Why are those threads of deep outsiderness, those threads that are so targeted and tarnished by society as dangerous and needing to be outsidered? I mean, Emma Goldman was called the most dangerous woman in America when she was alive. Why is it Davka? Why is it specifically those cultural realms that have influenced zine making? And mainly, why is it those cultural realms that Davka need to influence our Jewish experience moving forward?
To me, it's unfortunate that people have a view largely in like the popular imagination of anarchism. They wouldn't even call it anarchism. They call it anarchy. That people have this view of it as being violent, destructive, chaotic, all of these kind of negative connotations. But anarchism to me and to most anarchists, from OGs like Peter Kropotkin, talk about rejecting being a part of the elite. Maybe he's like the anarchist version of Jeremiah, that he rejected being a part of the elite and saw that like this world is deeply broken and in desperate need of repair. And we are the people we have been waiting for to do it. Kropotkin wasn't a Jew, but tell me that doesn't sound like Tikkun Olam. And it doesn't sound like the Kabbalistic perspective at the creation of the world. Maybe because the world was created and the universe was created so powerful that it couldn't help but scatter all of divinity and all of these sparks of divinity out. And then they get kind of just like clouded by all of these things clinging to them that hide their shine. This is like the most like not precise version of raising the sparks. But I think that that's what anarchism is. Anarchism is about raising the sparks, that like there is something inherently beautiful about this world. In fact, like communists, socialists, anarchists, we've called it the beautiful idea. This world could be so much more than it is. One of the things that I think propelled Jewish Zine Archive into a much more visible space was early on in the zine subscription series. I made an illustration that is chain that's being broken and kind of exploding open. And within it is text that reads, "There are no prisoners in Olam Haba." Olam Haba, the world to come. I think anarchists deeply believe in Olam Haba. They're just using different words for it. To me, that's why so many Jews have been anarchists, have been socialists, have been communists, and broadly speaking, leftists, because we also believe in a world to come. Olam Haba is real and we make it real. I don't use Olam Haba in the way that some people do to mean an afterlife. I actually think that's like a wrong read. Olam Haba is like the world that we renew and we repair, and it is an iterative process. I'm not sure what it is about punks and weirdos and true freaks in the world and people on the margins and the fringes that make us more able to see Olam Haba, but I think we can. And I think we can see those sparks of divinity out in the universe and around us, even in the most mundane and banal spaces. I think we can see them. And I think that's also ties back to this ethos around zine making, that it's something we have to do ourselves. We have to tell our stories. We have to express what we see. And sometimes we're expressing the brokenness and the pain. Sometimes we're expressing the banal and the mundane. And sometimes we get to express Olam Haba and make it real in this world. That's what I think zinesters writ large across the globe are doing, little bit by little bit. Whether they know it or not, we are making Olam Haba real in this present moment.
Thank you so much, Chava Shapiro, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Oh my God, thank you. Baruch Hashem that I finally did it. I got on Judaism Unbound.
And we finally had you as a guest on Judaism Unbound. So all of us having a monumental occasion today. As a reminder, we have our mini courses in the Onion Yeshiva, including Chava Shapiro's own class, Unraveling Jewish Zines, from Rashi to the Haggadah to Instagram. So head to judaismunbound.com/classes. Do not pass go. You can pass go, actually. You can do whatever you want with respect to go. But head also to judaismunbound.com/classes. Sign up for this class. Check out our other upcoming classes, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, the Torah of Wholeness and Becoming with C.B. Souther, and Birthing and Dying, Jewishly Reimagining Life's Many Beginnings and Endings with Miriam Grossman. So we hope that you'll sign up for those. There's financial aid available. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to be in touch. And if you're wondering, what are the ways I could be in touch? Amazing question. Here they are. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, info about the Onion Yeshiva, all sorts of goodies. And there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Send us your thoughts on this conversation, your visions for the Jewish future, whatever is coming to you, email them our way. And before we go, support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.